The wind on Halvern Ridge did not howl that night. It screamed. Snow moved sideways through the trees in sheets so thick that the beam of a lantern could not reach 10 steps ahead of it, and the temperature outside the ranger station had dropped low enough that the metal door handle burned bare skin on contact. Mara Voss had lived on this ridge for 6 winters, and she had learned long ago that a storm like this one did not care who you were, what you had survived before, or how many supply runs you had made without incident. It only cared whether you were smart enough to stay indoors. She was not planning to go outside. She had a fire built up in the stove, a pot of stew simmering, and a stack of maintenance logs she had been putting off for a month. Then she heard the sound. It was not the wind. She knew every voice the wind on this ridge could make. The low moan through the pass, the sharp whistle around the chimney, the deep structural groan of the station's old timber frame settling under the weight of snow. This was different. It was thin and high and broken, rising and falling in a pattern that had nothing mechanical about it. It sounded like something in pain. It sounded, though she told herself this was impossible, like something crying. She stood at the window for almost a full minute, telling herself it was a trick of the storm, that sound bent strangely in weather like this, that there was nothing alive foolish enough to be out on the ridge tonight except her. The sound came again, closer this time, threading in under the wind rather than through it. She pulled on her coat before she had fully decided to go outside. Some decisions get made by the body before the mind finishes arguing with itself. The cold outside hit like a wall. She kept one gloved hand on the guide rope strung between the station and the equipment shed, the same rope she had installed after her second winter here nearly cost her a set of fingers, and she followed the sound with her head down and her lantern raised only high enough to see the next few feet of white ground. It took her almost 15 minutes to find the source. 15 minutes that felt considerably longer, with ice forming on her eyelashes and her breath freezing before it left her scarf. What she found at the base of a split boulder near the tree line was not what she expected. It was small, smaller than she would have guessed possible for what it clearly was, curled into the tightest ball its body could manage, wings wrapped around itself in a desperate attempt at insulation that was failing badly. Its scales, what she could see of them under the snow that had already begun to collect on its back, were a deep blue that shifted toward violet where the lantern light caught it directly. One wing was bent at an angle that made her stomach turn even before she understood what she was looking at. It was a dragon. It was a baby dragon, alone, injured, and freezing to death 20 yards from her front door. Mara had not always been the kind of person who ran toward strange sounds in a blizzard. 6 winters earlier, she had taken the Halvern Ridge posting for reasons that had very little to do with wildlife management and a great deal to do with wanting to be somewhere far enough from other people that she would not have to explain herself to anyone. Her previous posting, closer to the lowland settlements, had ended badly after a disagreement with a regional administrator over how a border incident involving a wounded Skarath scout had been handled. An incident where Mara had argued for treatment and diplomacy and had been overruled by superiors who wanted the injured dragon removed from human territory as quickly and quietly as possible, regardless of its condition. She had lost that argument. She had watched the scout dragged off on a transport sled, still bleeding, while officials congratulated themselves on avoiding a diplomatic complication. She had requested a transfer to the most remote posting available within the month, and Halvern Ridge, isolated, thinly staffed, bordering contested Skarath territory, had been exactly what she was looking for. 6 years of solitude had suited her fine. She told herself she had stopped expecting the universe to hand her another chance to do the right thing when it mattered. She had been wrong about that, though she would not fully understand how wrong until a small crying sound cut through a snowstorm and gave her exactly the chance she thought she had left behind. She did not remember deciding to pick it up. She remembered the weight of it against her chest, lighter than she expected and yet somehow also heavier, The way anything fragile becomes heavier the moment you understand exactly how easily it could stop existing. The creature did not fight her. It should have. Every survival instinct in something wild should have made it thrash and bite and try to escape the massive, unfamiliar creature that had just scooped it off the ground. Instead, it pressed closer to her, seeking the heat radiating through her coat, making that same broken sound, but quieter now, more exhausted than desperate. She got back to the station on instinct alone, her hands too numb by the end to properly work the door latch, and she kicked it twice before it gave. The warmth inside hit both of them at once, and the dragon made a sound that was different from the crying, something closer to a shudder-given voice. She laid it down near the stove on a folded blanket, and only then, in the better light, did she see the full extent of what she was dealing with. The wing was broken, not shattered, but cracked cleanly enough that it would need to be set. There were shallow cuts along one flank, the kind an animal gets from being dragged or scraped across rock, and its claws were worn down at the tips in a way that suggested it had been trying to dig or climb for longer than a creature this young should have been capable of. It was thin in a way that worried her more than the injuries did. Whatever had happened to this hatchling, it had not simply wandered off a warm nest an hour ago. This had been going on for days. Mara had spent 6 years on a ridge that bordered contested territory, close enough to Scarrath ancestral grounds that she had seen adult dragons in flight more times than she could count, always from a careful distance, always with the practiced neutrality of someone who understood that this land held two very different kinds of history for two very different kinds of people. She had never been this close to one. She had certainly never held one in her arms while it shook against her chest, too weak and too cold to do anything but accept whatever warmth was offered. She did the only things she knew how to do. She built the fire higher. She found the thickest blankets in the station and layered them without smothering the creature, remembering vaguely from old survival texts that reptiles, and she assumed dragons counted as some distant relative of the category, needed external heat in a way mammals did not. She warmed water and, when the hatchling would not drink from a cup, dipped a clean cloth and let it draw moisture from the fabric instead, patient in a way she did not entirely recognize in herself. She splinted the wing as best she could with 2 thin strips of wood and a torn bandage, working slowly and murmuring the entire time in a low, steady voice, the same voice she used when calming spooked pack animals on the trail. Because some instincts translate across species even when nothing else does. By the time the worst of the shaking stopped, several hours had passed, and outside the storm had not eased at all. Mara sat on the floor beside the stove with her back against the wall, the hatchling curled in the space between her knees and her chest, and she found herself doing something she rarely did anymore after 6 years of solitary posting. She talked out loud, to no one, about nothing important, just the sound of a voice filling a small, warm room while something small and broken slowly stopped being afraid. She did not sleep that night. She told herself later it was because the fire needed tending and the wing needed to be checked for swelling, and both of those things were true. But the deeper truth was simpler than that. She could not make herself look away from it. There was something about watching a creature this small, this clearly capable of growing into something the size of a house, breathe slowly and safely for the first time in what must have been days, that held her attention more completely than anything had in a very long time. Morning came gray and still. The storm had finally broken sometime before dawn, leaving the ridge buried under drifts taller than Mara herself in places, the kind of snowfall that would take the supply road out of commission for at least a week. She used the quiet to properly examine her guest in daylight. It was smaller than she had first thought, perhaps the size of a large dog if you excluded the tail, with those deep blue-violet scales catching the morning light in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as though the color had been chosen rather than grown. Its eyes, when it finally opened them fully and looked at her, were a pale gold, and they held an alertness that unsettled her slightly. This was not the vacant stare of a wild animal assessing threat and food source. There was something calculating in it, something that felt closer to a person deciding whether to trust a stranger. She offered it a piece of dried meat from her own supplies. It sniffed the offering carefully, looked at her again with that same steady gold gaze, and then took the food gently from her fingers, careful in a way that surprised her given how hungry it clearly was. She decided in that moment, without any particular ceremony, that she was not going to report this through the standard channels immediately. She told herself it was because the road was buried and the nearest outpost with a working relay was 2 days out even in good weather. She suspected, somewhere underneath that reasoning, that it was also because she was not ready to hand this creature over to people who would see it as a diplomatic incident before they saw it as something frightened and hurt. The first real test of that fragile trust came on the third night, when the hatchling's fever spiked without warning. Mara woke sometime past midnight to a sound she had not heard before, a rasping, uneven breath that pulled her out of sleep faster than any alarm could have, and she found Ash trembling against her side, scales dulled and eyes half open, heat radiating off its small body in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. She had no medical training beyond basic field first aid designed for humans, no reference text for dragon physiology beyond the vague survival guide notes she had already exhausted, and no way to call for help with the relay still buried under storm damage. She did the only thing she could think to do. She soaked clods in cool water and laid them along the hatchling's flanks, careful to avoid the healing wing, and she sat with it through the entire night, monitoring its breathing, adjusting the cloths, talking the entire time in the same low, steady voice she had used since the first hour, because it was the only tool she had, and because stopping felt, in some instinctive and unexplainable way, more dangerous than anything else she could do wrong. Somewhere around 4 a.m, the fever broke, sweat, or its scaled equivalent, beating along the ridges above its eyes, and the breathing evened out into something closer to normal sleep. Mara did not move from that spot until well past dawn, arms stiff, back aching against the wall, and she remembered thinking, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had not been this frightened for another living thing in longer than she wanted to admit. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them had chosen, but both of them settled into easily enough. Mara kept the fire burning hot enough to compensate for the outside cold, adjusted the splint twice as the swelling in the wing went down, and spent hours simply sitting near the hatchling doing paperwork or repairing equipment while it dozed nearby. Always within reach of the warmth, always, she began to notice, positioned so it could see her without turning its head. By the 4th day it had a name. Not because she had decided to name it, but because she had taken to calling it something during the long, one-sided conversations she kept having, and the name had simply stuck. She called it Ash, for the color the blue scales took on in low firelight, somewhere between smoke and violet. Living alongside a recovering hatchling changed the small daily rhythms of the station in ways Mara had not anticipated. She learned to keep the woodpile stacked closer to the door because Ash startled at the sound of the outer hinge and settled faster if she could get back inside quickly. She learned that the creature disliked the particular scrape of her boots against the stone threshold and would flatten his ears or the small ridges above his eyes that seemed to serve the same purpose whenever she forgot to wipe them clean before entering. She learned, more slowly, that he had begun watching the door itself with an expression that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with waiting, tracking her comings and goings the way a much older, much more deliberate creature might track the movement of something it had already decided mattered. She caught herself on the 6th or 7th morning, narrating her breakfast preparation out loud purely out of habit, describing the eggs and the dried mountain berries and the strength of the tea she was brewing, and she realized partway through that Ash had stopped whatever he was doing to simply listen, head tilted, entirely still. The same posture he brought to every conversation, whether or not he understood a single word of it. She decided that morning that understanding the words was probably beside the point. Ash grew stronger with a speed that startled her. By the end of the first week, it was walking without favoring the healed wing, testing short hops around the station with an energy that made Mara nervous about her carefully organized shelving. It had opinions, she discovered, strong ones, expressed through a range of small sounds and even smaller gestures that she found herself becoming fluent in far faster than seemed reasonable. A particular low chirp meant hunger. A soft rattling sound, felt more than heard, meant contentment, and she noticed it most often when she was talking, whether to Ash directly or simply narrating her own tasks the way she had that first long night. A sharp huff, nostrils flaring, meant Ash had encountered something it considered beneath its dignity, usually the taste of the powdered protein rations Mara occasionally supplemented into its diet. She should have reported the discovery the moment the road cleared. She knew this. Halvern Ridge sat inside a formal treaty zone, one of several buffer territories established after the last serious conflict between human settlements and the Skaroth clans nearly 2 decades earlier. And any contact with a Skaroth individual, particularly a hatchling, particularly one that appeared to have no parent or clan nearby, was supposed to be reported within 48 hours under the terms both sides had signed. She had let 10 days pass. Part of her reasoning was practical. She did not know which clan Ash belonged to, did not know how the hatchling had ended up alone and injured on human-administered land, and did not know whether reporting it immediately would result in a careful, respectful return or a diplomatic disaster that would end with soldiers on both sides reaching for weapons over a misunderstanding neither of them had caused. The other part of her reasoning was harder to admit even to herself, and it had everything to do with the way Ash had started sleeping curled directly against her side instead of near the stove, close enough that she could feel the slow rhythm of its breathing through her own ribs at night. On the 11th day, the relay finally crackled back to life after the storm damage was repaired, and Mara sat in front of it for nearly an hour, composing and deleting the same message before she finally sent something honest. She reported the discovery of an injured Skaroth hatchling, alone on Halvern Ridge, currently recovering under her care, and she requested guidance on proper procedure for contact and return. She did not mention how many days had actually passed. She told herself that detail was not strictly relevant to the report. She knew, even as she told herself that, it was a small lie of omission that she was going to have to answer for eventually. The response came faster than she expected, and it did not come from the outpost command she had contacted. It came, less than 6 hours later, in the form of a formal transmission relayed through 3 separate diplomatic channels, carrying the seal of the Skaroth Northern Conclave, addressed directly to the human occupant of Halvern Ridge Station. Mara stared at the message for a long moment before opening it, aware in some instinctive way that whatever was inside was going to change the shape of the last 11 days considerably. The message was brief and precise, translated into careful, formal common tongue that stripped away any warmth the original might have carried. It stated that a hatchling belonging to the Var lineage of the Northern Conclave had been reported missing following a rock slide that struck a migratory nesting site 3 weeks prior, an event that had also claimed the life of the hatchling's mother and destroyed most of the physical evidence needed to determine what had caused the slide in the first place. It stated that search efforts across the affected region had continued without success for over 2 weeks. It stated that a delegation would arrive at Halvern Ridge within 4 days to confirm the hatchling's identity and, if confirmed, arrange its return. It also stated, in language considerably less neutral than the rest of the message, that questions remained regarding whether the rock slide that killed the hatchling's mother had been a natural event or the result of unauthorized human mining activity in a region where such activity was explicitly prohibited under treaty terms, and that the delegation would be accompanied by an investigative envoy tasked with determining responsibility. Mara read the message 3 times. Then she looked over at Ash, currently occupied with attempting to disassemble one of her bootlaces with focused determination, entirely unaware that a diplomatic storm considerably more dangerous than the blizzard that had brought them together was now 4 days out and closing. She spent those 4 days in a state of low-grade dread that she did their best not to let show, though she suspected Ash noticed anyway. Dragons, she had learned over the past 11 days, seemed to read tone and posture with an accuracy that made most attempts at hiding emotion pointless. On the second day, she caught herself explaining the situation out loud to Ash in full. The rock slide, the missing mother, the coming delegation, the accusations of human involvement that she had absolutely nothing to do with, but that could still, depending on how things went, end her posting and possibly a great deal more. Ash listened with the same still attentiveness it brought to everything, head tilted slightly, and made no sound at all until she finished talking, at which point it pressed its head briefly against her hand, a gesture she had come to understand meant something like reassurance, though she was fairly certain that reading comfort into the behavior of a creature this young was probably more about her own need for comfort than any actual understanding on Ash's part. She was wrong about that, though she would not fully understand how wrong until later. On the third of those 4 waiting days, a second transmission arrived, this one unofficial, routed through a private channel that should not have had access to the station's relay at all. It came from someone identifying themselves only as a member of the Kaldrek line, a rival Skarath faction with a long and well-documented history of opposing any formal contact with human settlements. And its message was considerably less diplomatic than the Conclave's. It stated that the Kaldrek line considered the presence of a Skarath hatchling inside human territory for any duration, under any circumstances, to be an unacceptable breach requiring immediate and forceful correction, and that if the Northern Conclave was unwilling to act with appropriate urgency, others would act in their place. Mara read the message twice, felt something cold settle low in her stomach, and immediately forwarded it to the Outpost Command, along with her original report, adding a request for any available security support ahead of the delegation's arrival. The response she received back was not reassuring. Regional Command confirmed the Kaldrek line had grown increasingly aggressive over the past year, blamed for at least 2 unresolved incidents along the northern treaty border, and warned her that if any of their number arrived at Halvern Ridge before the Conclave delegation did, she should avoid confrontation entirely and prioritize the hatchling's safety over her own. She spent that night with the station's few defensive measures checked and rechecked, doors reinforced as best she could manage, and Ash curled tightly against her, seemingly aware, in whatever way a creature that young could be aware, that something in the air had shifted. Nothing came that night. Nothing came the next day either, though Mara found herself checking the tree line far more often than the work in front of her strictly required. It was not until the delegation itself was less than an hour out, confirmed by a short relay transmission from Savannah's own party, that Mara finally allowed herself to exhale fully, though the warning from the Kaldrek line stayed lodged in the back of her mind for the rest of the week. A quiet reminder that not everyone on either side of the old treaty line wanted this story to end peacefully. The delegation arrived on the morning of the 4th day, and Mara heard them before she saw them, a low, resonant sound moving through the ridge that she felt in her chest before her ears fully registered it as anything. She stepped outside into clear, cold air to watch 3 enormous shapes descend out of the pale morning sky, wings catching the light in shades of deep gray and iron, landing with a controlled precision that packed considerably more raw power into the movement than she had ever seen up close. The largest of the 3, easily twice Mara's height even in a lowered stance, was clearly the one in charge, and everything about her bearing, the way she held herself, the way the other 2 arranged themselves slightly behind and to either side, confirmed it before a single word was spoken. Beside them stood a 4th figure, human, dressed in the formal charcoal uniform of the Treaty Oversight Office, carrying a datapad and an expression that suggested he had already decided how this meeting was going to go before it started. His name, Mara would learn within the first few minutes, was Investigator Colm Reyes, and he had clearly been briefed on the possibility that whoever occupied Halvern Ridge Station had something to hide. The large dragon spoke first, in careful common tongue, her voice carrying a weight that made Mara understand immediately why the 2 accompanying her held their positions with such deference. "My name is Savannah," she said. "I am mother's sister to the hatchling you found. I have come to see for myself." Reyes stepped forward before Mara could respond, datapad raised. Ranger Voss, he said, I need to remind you that failure to report contact with a Scarith individual within the mandated window constitutes a treaty violation, and I will be documenting the full timeline of this incident starting now. Mara felt something settle in her chest, cold and steady, the particular calm that sometimes arrives right when panic would otherwise take over. She had spent 11 days telling herself a small lie about the timeline. She was not going to compound it with a larger one in front of an investigator whose entire job today was catching exactly that kind of lie. Understood, she said. The hatchling was found 10 days before I filed my report. I should have reported it immediately. I did not, and I take full responsibility for that delay. I'll explain my reasoning and you can decide what to do with it. But I'm not going to pretend the timeline was different than it was. Reyes looked mildly surprised at the immediate admission, and beside him, Savannah's head turned slightly, gold eyes fixing on Mara with an attention that felt considerably sharper than before. Explain, Savannah said, before Reyes could speak again. Mara took a breath. I found your hatchling half buried in snow during the worst storm this ridge has seen in 6 years, injured, alone, and close enough to dead that another hour outside probably would have finished the job. I didn't know what clan it belonged to, didn't know how it got there, and didn't know whether reporting it immediately would get it back to its family safely or get it caught in the middle of an argument between people with much bigger weapons than I have. I made the call to stabilize it first and figure out the politics after. I know that's not what the treaty says I'm supposed to do. I'd make the same call again. Silence settled over the clearing outside the station for a long moment. Then Savannah spoke, quieter now. Take me to him. Inside the station, Ash had heard the commotion and was sitting upright near the stove, wings half raised in a posture Mara had never seen before, alert and uncertain, watching the door. The moment Savannah's massive frame ducked through the entrance, filling nearly the entire front room, something in Ash's posture changed completely. The half-raised wings dropped. A sound came out of the hatchling that Mara had never heard it make before, high and immediate and unmistakably a name. And Ash crossed the distance between them faster than Mara had ever seen it move, pressing itself against Savannah's foreleg with a desperation that made the last 11 days suddenly feel very small and very temporary by comparison. Savannah lowered her head and made a sound in return, low and resonant, the kind of sound Mara felt more than heard. And for several long minutes neither dragon moved. The larger one curled protectively around the smaller, both of them simply present with each other in a way that needed no translation at all. Reyes, to his credit, stood quietly through the reunion and did not attempt to interrupt it with procedure. When Savannah finally lifted her head again, there were details Mara had not expected. She learned that Ash's actual name, in the careful phonetics of draconic naming conventions, was something considerably longer and harder to pronounce than the syllable Mara had been using, but that Savannah, hearing it, made no correction, only a small sound that might have been the dragon equivalent of quiet amusement. She learned that the rock slide had occurred during a routine migration between nesting grounds, that it had struck without warning during a period of unusually warm weather that had destabilized snowpack across several ridgelines simultaneously, and that Ash had been swept nearly 4 kilometers from the nesting site by the resulting avalanche, ending up, against every reasonable probability, close enough to Halvern Ridge Station to be heard through a blizzard by someone willing to go outside and look. Reyes, still working through his own procedural checklist, asked the question everyone had been avoiding. Was there any indication of mining activity in the area prior to the slide? Savannah's expression, if the sharpening of her golden eyes could be called that, shifted towards something colder. That is what my envoy is here to determine, she said. I will say only this. I did not come to Halvern Ridge looking for someone to blame. I came because my hatchling was missing. And now he is not. Whatever caused the mountain to move, it was not this woman, and I will not have that confusion cloud what actually matters here. The investigation itself took 4 full days, and Mara watched more of it unfold than she expected to. Reyes, once the initial accusatory framing of his arrival had passed, turned out to be considerably more thorough than she had first assumed, and considerably more willing to follow evidence wherever it actually led rather than wherever it might have been politically convenient for it to lead. He walked the affected ridgeline personally, alongside two of Savannah's surveyors, cataloging snowpack density readings, checking historical weather records against the timeline of the slide, and cross-referencing every mining permit filed within 50 kilometers of the site over the preceding year. He found nothing. What he did find, buried in an old seismic survey record from nearly a decade earlier, was a note flagging that particular ridgeline as geologically unstable during periods of rapid thaw. A note that had apparently never been forwarded to either the Scarth Migratory Planning Council or the Human Settlements Office responsible for permit approvals. It was, in the end, a tragedy born of an old bureaucratic oversight rather than malice from either side, which Mara found somehow both a relief and a fresh source of quiet anger on Savannah's behalf. On the evening before he departed, Reyes sat briefly with Mara outside the station, datapad finally set aside. "I came here fairly sure I was going to be writing you up for a treaty violation, and possibly worse," he admitted. "I want you to know that's not how I'm writing this report." Mara studied him for a moment. "What changed your mind?" she asked. He considered the question longer than she expected. "Watching that dragon look at you the way he does," he said finally. "You can fake a lot of things for an investigator. You can't fake that." The investigation that followed over the next several days, conducted with Savannah's own search and survey party working alongside Reyes rather than against him, eventually confirmed what geological records had already suggested. The slide had been a natural event, triggered by an unusually rapid seasonal thaw 2 full months before any mining permit for that region had even been filed. No human activity was involved. Reyes documented this conclusion with the same careful precision he had brought to his initial accusation, and to his credit, he included in his final report a note recommending that Mara Voss receive commendation rather than reprimand for her handling of the hatchling's medical care, whatever procedural violation the delay in reporting might technically represent. The Kaldrek warning did not stay a distant threat for long. On the second night of the delegation's stay, one of Savannah's own scouts spotted movement along the tree line, roughly a kilometer from the station. 3 unidentified Scarth individuals moving with deliberate stealth in a pattern that suggested reconnaissance rather than simple travel. Savannah's party responded immediately, 2 of her escorts launching to intercept while she herself remained at the station, refusing to leave the hatchling's side even as tension rippled visibly through her party. The confrontation that followed happened far enough from the station that Mara only heard fragments of it secondhand. A brief exchange of raised voices in Draconic carried on the wind, a single sharp cry that made her chest go tight with fear for reasons she could not fully name, and then silence. When Savannah's escorts returned nearly an hour later, they reported that the 3 intruders had been Kaldrek scouts, sent to assess whether the situation at Halvern Ridge matched the alarming rumors already spreading through their faction, and that they had been turned back without serious violence, though not without a clear and unambiguous warning about what would happen if they returned. Savannah addressed the incident directly with Mara afterward, something in her manner more guarded than it had been before. "The Kaldrek line believes any hatchling who spends time among humans is compromised," she said. "That the bond formed cannot be trusted, that it represents a vulnerability our people cannot afford. I do not share that belief. I have watched my hatchling in your care for 3 days now, and I have watched him look at you the way he once looked only at his mother. That is not compromise." She paused, studying Mara with an intensity that felt like being weighed on some scale Mara could not see the markings of. "But I will not pretend the Kaldrek line does not have followers, and I will not pretend they will simply accept whatever conclusion this investigation reaches. There may be consequences to this becoming known beyond what either of us can control." Mara had no good answer to that, only the honest one. "Then we deal with those consequences when they come," she said. I'm not going to pretend I regret any of this just because it made someone angry who was never going to be happy no matter what happened. But the investigation was never really the center of what happened at Halvern Ridge that week, and everyone involved seemed to understand that even before it concluded. The center of it was the several days Savannah's party remained on the ridge while formal matters were finalized. Days during which Mara watched something she had not expected to witness firsthand. The slow and careful process of a Scarath matriarch reassessing everything she thought she understood about the species living on the other side of an old, uneasy treaty line. Savannah asked questions Mara had not anticipated. She asked how Mara had known to warm the water rather than let Ash drink it cold, and Mara admitted she had guessed based on old survival texts and had gotten lucky. She asked why Mara had spoken to Ash so consistently during those first days, and Mara, slightly embarrassed, explained that talking out loud was simply how she processed problems when she was alone, and that she supposed the habit had carried over. Savannah was quiet for a long moment after that answer, then told her something Mara had not known, that Scarath hatchlings in their earliest weeks bond partly through sustained vocal presence, that the steady sound of a voice signals safety in a way almost nothing else does, and that whether or not Mara had understood what she was doing, she had done precisely the thing a hatchling in that condition needed most. On the final evening before the delegation was set to depart, Mara sat outside the station in the cold, clear air, watching Ash attempt, with limited success, to teach one of the younger members of Savannah's party a game involving a smooth river stone that Mara had given him during the recovery. Savannah settled beside her, taking up considerably more space than the narrow bench Mara occupied, but somehow not crowding her at all. "What you did," Savannah said eventually, "was not required of you. You could have left him where you found him. Many would have." Mara considered the statement for a moment. "He was a kid crying in the snow," she said. "I don't think I ever really had a choice in the way you mean it." Savannah made a low sound that Mara had come to recognize as something close to approval. That, she said, is precisely why it mattered. Before the party departed the following morning, Savannah made a formal request through Reyes, one that would take several weeks to work through official channels, but that eventually reshaped the relationship between Halvern Ridge Station and the Northern Conclave for years afterward. She requested that Mara Voss be designated an official point of contact for any future incidents involving Scarath individuals in the region, a role that came with expanded authority, direct communication access to the Conclave, and, unofficially, an open invitation that Ash himself made abundantly clear he intended to take advantage of as often as possible. The Kaldrek line did not vanish quietly. A few months later, one of their delegates formally challenged the new arrangement before the full Conclave Assembly, demanding that all contact between the hatchling and the human station be cut off. Savannah answered with a single line that ended the challenge on the spot. She invited anyone who doubted her judgment to travel to Halvern Ridge and watch her hatchling in that ranger's company before condemning something they had never bothered to see for themselves. No one took her up on it. The challenge was withdrawn without a vote. Ash returned to the ridge often after that, each visit marking how much he had grown since the night she had found him buried in snow. He brought her small things. River stones, a bundle of dried mountain flowers, once a carved wooden bead he clearly was not supposed to have taken. She kept every one of them on the shelf above the stove. 2 winters after that first storm, on a night far calmer than the one that started it all, Mara heard the low, resonant call Ash's voice had grown into. He landed in the clearing, too large now to fit through her door, carrying a small, wrapped bundle in his foreclaws. Inside was a stone, shaped and polished, the same deep blue violet as his scales, small enough to sit in her palm, warm in a way she never could quite explain. She still keeps it on that shelf, in the same spot where a small, frightened, freezing creature once lay wrapped in blankets, while a storm screamed outside, and a woman who had spent 6 winters alone talked quietly into the dark, not entirely sure anyone was listening, until something small pressed closer to the sound of her voice and decided in whatever way creatures that young decide such things, that it had finally found the right place to be found.